October 22nd, 1777. Red Bank, New Jersey. Across the open ground stood more than 1,000 Hessian soldiers. They were professional troops, Prussian-trained, battle-hardened, men who had fought in Europe and had already crushed American formations at Long Island and White Plains, and now they were staring at a dirt fort, defended by roughly 400 Americans. To the Hessians, it looked like an easy victory. The fort was unfinished. The garrison was tiny, and Colonel Carl von Donop had been given one simple task: take Fort Mercer. But there was something the Hessians couldn't see. The fort was not weak. It was a trap, and in the next 40 minutes, that trap would turn an elite assault force into a wreck. Hundreds of Hessians would be killed, wounded, or captured. Their commander would be mortally wounded, and the Americans would suffer only a fraction of the losses. This is the story of how 400 Americans stopped one of the most feared fighting forces in the British Army. Red Bank, 1777. By October 1777, British General William Howe had captured Philadelphia. On paper, it looked like a major victory. The American capital was in British hands. Washington's army had been beaten at Brandywine. Congress had fled. But Howe had a serious problem. Philadelphia was sitting at the end of the Delaware River, and that river was the British Army's lifeline. British ships needed to move supplies upriver. Food, ammunition, weapons, everything an army occupying Philadelphia needed to survive. But the Americans had blocked the river. Two forts controlled the approaches: Fort Mifflin on the Pennsylvania side, and Fort Mercer at Red Bank on the New Jersey shore. Between them, the Americans had placed massive underwater obstacles called chevaux de frise, iron-tipped wooden beams designed to tear open the hulls of British ships. As long as those forts remained in American hands, Philadelphia was difficult to supply. Howe needed the river, and that meant he needed the forts. So he decided to attack both. The Royal Navy would deal with Fort Mifflin, and on the New Jersey side he would send the men everyone feared most: the Hessians. The Hessian soldiers serving Britain were professional troops from German states, especially Hesse-Kassel. They were trained under strict European military discipline. They were experienced. They were aggressive, and American soldiers already knew what happened when Hessian grenadiers charged. These were not men Howe expected to frighten easily. He needed someone who could break Fort Mercer. He chose Colonel Carl von Donop. And for Donop, this wasn't just another battlefield. It was personal. Almost a year earlier, Donop had been connected to one of the most embarrassing moments of the war: Trenton. On Christmas night, George Washington crossed the Delaware and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The Hessian commander there, Colonel Johann Rall, was killed. Hundreds of Hessian soldiers were captured, and Donop had been nearby. He had troops of his own, but he did not reach Trenton in time to save the garrison. Whether the failure was entirely his fault or not, the disaster damaged his reputation. Now, 10 months later, he had another chance. A chance to prove that the Hessians could still destroy an American position. A chance to erase Trenton. And this time, he wasn't attacking an open army. He was attacking a fort defended by only about 400 men. Inside Fort Mercer was Colonel Christopher Greene. Greene commanded 2 Rhode Island regiments. These were not simply untrained farmers who had grabbed muskets and walked onto the battlefield. They were Continental soldiers. They had marched. They had fought. And many had already experienced the brutal campaigns of the Revolution. But Greene had a problem. His garrison was tiny. The fort was too large for the number of men he had. If he spread his soldiers around the entire perimeter, every section would be weak. If he concentrated them in one area, the Hessians could simply attack somewhere else. It looked like the fort was doomed. Then a young French engineer arrived. His name was Duplessis, and he saw something everyone else had missed. The fort didn't need to be bigger. It needed to be smaller. Duplessis ordered his men to build a new defensive wall inside the existing fort. The result was strange. From the outside, Fort Mercer still looked large, but the Americans would no longer defend the entire structure. Part of the fort would be abandoned. The Hessians would see the outer walls. They would see the ditch. They would see the wooden defenses. And they would assume that if they crossed those obstacles, they would be inside the fort. But they wouldn't. Behind the first defensive line was another, a second wall, a tighter defensive position, a place where the 400 Americans could concentrate their fire. And that created something extremely dangerous, a killing ground. If the Hessians broke through the outer defenses, they would enter an exposed section of the fort, with American soldiers firing at them from multiple directions. The trap was invisible from outside. The fort looked vulnerable, but its weakness had been deliberately designed. Now Greene had something he didn't have before, a way for 400 men to fight like a much larger garrison. Du Plessis also strengthened the inner defenses and positioned the artillery, so that the abandoned section could be swept by cannon fire. The Americans were ready. They didn't need to chase the Hessians. They didn't need to defeat them in the open. They simply had to make the Hessians come to them, and Donop was about to do exactly that. On October 22nd, Donop's troops approached Fort Mercer. The Hessian force assigned to the assault was vastly larger than the American garrison. Donop formed his troops for the attack. Drums, flags, grenadiers, Jaegers, professional soldiers, moving toward a fort held by a few 100 defenders. Then Donop sent forward an officer under a white flag. The message was a demand for surrender. The Americans were ordered to lay down their arms, and the warning was brutal. If they refused, no quarter would be given, no mercy. Greene had a chance to surrender. He refused. His answer became one of the most famous moments of the battle. "We ask no quarter, nor will we give any." The Hessian messenger returned. Donop had his answer. The drums sounded. The Hessian columns began moving. The first thing the Hessians encountered was the open ground. They moved forward under American artillery fire, but they kept coming. Then they reached the ditch, and beyond it was the abatis. Trees had been cut down and arranged, with their branches pointing toward the attackers. It was a wall of sharpened wood. The Hessians had brought fascines, bundles of material used to help cross the ditch. But cutting through the abatis was another problem. The attackers struggled against the obstacles. They tried to push through. They tried to climb over. They tried to find gaps. And every second they spent there was another second for the Americans to fire. Then one Hessian column managed to reach the outer defenses. They crossed. They got inside. For a moment it looked like the fort was about to fall. And then they saw the second wall. The trap had closed. The Hessians were suddenly standing in an exposed space. American muskets opened fire from the inner defenses. Then the cannon joined them. Grape shot tore through the packed attackers. Instead of fighting one line of American soldiers, the Hessians were being hit from positions they had not expected to exist. The soldiers who had believed they were storming the fort were now trapped between defenses, and there was almost nowhere to hide. On the other sides of the fort, the situation was just as bad. The Hessian columns struggled against the abatis. American soldiers fired from behind cover. The artillery continued pounding the attackers. And from the Delaware River, American gunboats added their own fire. The Hessians were being attacked from the fort and from the river, but they kept trying. Donop's officers attempted to push the men forward. Another assault, then another. But the Americans were not breaking. The fort was doing exactly what Du Plessis had designed it to do. Every obstacle slowed the Hessians. Every delay concentrated them under fire. And every step forward brought them deeper into the killing zone. Donop knew the attack was failing, but he had something to prove. He had already failed to prevent the disaster at Trenton. He had spent months carrying that humiliation. He was not going to turn away easily. So he remained near the front, trying to rally his soldiers, trying to force another breakthrough. Then the American fire found him. Donop was struck in the hip. The wound was devastating. He fell among the men he had brought to Red Bank. His command structure began collapsing around him. The Hessians had reached the fort, but they could not take it. Their attacks had failed. Their commander was down, and the battlefield was becoming filled with their dead and wounded. After roughly 40 minutes, the Hessians finally pulled back. The attack was over. Fort Mercer still stood, and the American garrison was still inside it. The Hessians had failed to accomplish the one thing they had crossed the Delaware to do: take the fort. When the battlefield finally became quiet, the scale of the disaster became clear. The official Hessian report recorded 371 men killed, wounded or captured, including 22 officers. Other historians have suggested the real total may have approached 400. The Americans reported only a small fraction of that number, roughly 3 dozen killed and wounded depending on the account. The contrast was extraordinary. A much smaller American garrison had stopped a professional assault force. And the reason wasn't simply courage. It wasn't simply numbers. It was preparation. Greene had held the fort. Du Plessis had redesigned it. The abatis had slowed the attack. The hidden inner wall had turned a breakthrough into a trap, and American artillery and river gunboats had added fire from multiple directions. The Hessians had been sent to storm a weak fort. Instead, they had stormed a carefully engineered killing ground. Donop was still alive. American soldiers found him among the wounded. He was carried into the fort. And there, the man who had demanded no quarter from the Americans now depended on those same Americans to keep him alive. He reportedly encountered Duplessis. The dying Hessian commander asked who he was. When he learned that Duplessis was a French officer, Donop reportedly replied in French that he was content to die in the hands of honor. Donop survived for 3 days. On October 25th, he died from his wounds. Later accounts attributed famous final words to him about dying as a victim of his own ambition and the greed of his sovereign. The exact wording is disputed, but one thing was certain. The man who had crossed the Delaware expecting to restore his reputation had instead suffered the very kind of disaster he had come to prevent. And then came the second disaster. The British still needed the Delaware River. The forts were still blocking their supply route. The next day, British warships attempted to force their way through the river defenses. But the same obstacles that had protected Fort Mercer were waiting in the water. 2 British ships ran aground while trying to maneuver through the narrow channel. The British could not simply sail past. American batteries and naval forces opened fire. The river itself had become another defensive weapon. The British had expected Philadelphia to be their great victory of 1777. Instead, they were discovering that capturing a city was not the same thing as being able to hold it. Fort Mercer had survived. Fort Mifflin was still resisting, and the Delaware remained closed. The British would eventually overcome the river defenses, but Donop's assault was never repeated. The price had been too high. Red Bank was not the largest battle of the American Revolution. It did not destroy the British Army, and Fort Mercer would not remain in American hands forever. But for 40 minutes on October 22nd, 1777, something extraordinary happened. A few hundred American defenders took a fort that looked too weak to hold and turned its weakness into a weapon. The Hessians arrived expecting an easy victory. They found a trap. They attacked with professional discipline. The Americans answered with preparation. They brought numbers. The Americans brought a fortress designed for those numbers. They brought elite soldiers. The Americans gave them obstacles, crossfire, and concentrated artillery. And when the smoke finally cleared, Fort Mercer was still standing. The Hessians were gone. Their commander was dying, and hundreds of their soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. 400 Americans, 2,000 Hessians, 1 fort, 40 minutes, and one of the most devastating defensive victories of the Revolution. Red Bank, 1777.